The world is so topsy-turvy that even I read a horror book. Hi, welcome, come on in. My name is Hifa, and today I am here with you to wrap up my October reading. October was a kind of an up and down month for me. I felt like I was in a bit of a reading slump, but when I came out with the amount of books that I had read actually tallied up, turns out that I did a little bit better than I thought. Across October, I was also taking part in 3 separate readathons. I was one of the team hosts for Fabelin, which was run by Margaret from The Word Nerd, and I was also taking part in TBR Harvestathon, which was run by Leandra from Leandra and the TBR Zero. I took the path of the trick-or-treating sheet, so I had to collect as many items as I could across October so that by the end of Halloween, all of my bags were filled with some really nice goodies. And I also took part in Spookoplathon, which was run by Becca from Becca and Her Books. I didn't really do as well with that one as I wanted to. I had set out a TBR at the start of the month. I don't necessarily know if I've got all of the squares ticked off. But let's talk about what did happen throughout October. Across the month of October, I read 12 books and I DNF'd another one of them. Of the 12 books that I read, 10 of them were written with an adult audience in mind, 1 was written for a YA audience, and 1 was a children's book. I read 1 book as a physical book, 4 books were ebooks, and 7 of them were audiobooks, which totaled up to 1,552 pages and 62 hours worth of audiobook. For the genres, I read 5 contemporary books, 1 memoir, 1 poetry, 2 fantasy books, I know, 2 horror books, I know, and a romance book. For the ratings, 1 book got a 4.5 star rating, 5 books got 4 stars, 2 books got a 3.5 star, 2 books got a 3 star, and 2 books, which were non-fiction, didn't get any ratings at all. As is customary over here, let's start out with the DNF, and that was A Witch's Guide to Fake Dating a Demon by Sarah Hawley. This is the first in a series, so I was really hoping that I'd get on really well with it and that I'd have 2 more books that I could discover in this world. But this book just didn't work for me for a couple of reasons. I think it's because I immediately read it right after another book that had a roughly similar theme, but a totally different vibe to it. This one was a lot steamier than I think I was expecting it to be. There was a lot of smut, there was a lot of sex scenes throughout this book, and I think I was just looking for something cozier. I was just looking for something that was going to wrap me up in a blanket, like a warm hug in the evenings, and this just didn't have the expectations I was looking for. I am not sure if this is a straight DNF or if this is just a not for now and I need to come back after a little while when I have washed it out of my system and when I'm ready to go back to it as a completely new book all over again. But I just think that the relationship between Mariel and Ozrath took a much different path than I was expecting it to, and because of that, it just didn't warm up to me. So, onto the books that I did read. And the first book that I finished across the month of October was The Pumpkin Spice Café by Laurie Gilmore. This had everything that I was looking for in a book. It was based in a small town. The focus was around a cafe. And I absolutely love books like that, especially when they've got a kind of an autumnal setting like this book did. I felt like it was the perfect transitional book because we still had the kind of heat from September, but we were starting to turn into those crisp October days that we're used to here in Berlin. This book is following Jeannie, who is given the deed to the Pumpkin Spice Cafe from her aunt, who has recently fallen ill and isn't able to keep going with the cafe herself anymore. So she moves to Dream Hollow, takes over the cafe, and is introduced to an entire population of all of the residents of Dream Hollow, including Logan, who is a local farmer and who isn't so welcoming to Jeannie's sunny disposition as she moves in. I really enjoy the cafe setting in this book, particularly because you see Jeannie really trying to get herself involved with the community. There are a couple of town meetings that she goes to. She really gets to know all of the other people around the community. She helps them out with some side quests that they have to do, for example. But it did feel a little bit too much like Stars Hollow at times. There was one particular moment of a town meeting very early on in this book that I thought was just lifted straight out of a Stars Hollow town meeting with Taylor running the whole situation. It really just felt a little bit too close to home for me. And there were times that the relationship between Jeannie and Logan felt a little bit too much like Lorelai and Luke for me to get on board and try and separate it out in my head, particularly because this does have the grumpy sunshine trope, and that is something that Luke and Lorelai embody in droves. I had heard before I picked up this book that about a year ago or so, when it had first come out, This book was rather mismarketed as a thriller, and when you're reading this book, you can kind of see where they were coming from. There is an underlying plot in this book where Jeannie keeps hearing some noises around the cafe. She keeps hearing a lot of clattering during the night, or will see people outside her window who will immediately jump away as soon as she's noticed the silhouette. And you're spending quite a lot of this book figuring out what the source of that noise is or what the silhouette outside the window is and trying to figure out why it's happening. I will admit that about 40 to 50% of the book, I had already figured out what was happening. And once you figure it out and you go back and you look at a couple of things, it starts to become a lot more obvious. Particularly when you go in, you're reading further and you know what's going on and why it's been going on. It was a little bit too open your eyes, it's right there in front of you. I can see why this was mismarketed as a thriller, and I can see why, because of that, quite a lot of people would have given it a lower rating. But I think it was fine for what it was. Am I going to continue on with the series? Not entirely sure. If I need something that's just brain off, I can pick it up and escape into a small town, I might go for the Cinnamon Bun bookstore and I might go for the Christmas Tree Farm. But it's not a huge priority for me right now. I ended up giving this book a 3.5-star rating. The very next day, I finished my next book across October, and that was Overshare by Charlotte L. Frears. This collection of about 30 or so poems details Charlotte's life after she has been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. It goes through a couple of dating mishaps that she's had, or relationships that she feels that have broken down recently, and the reasons that she thinks might be behind it. Quite a lot of it is very self-reflective, and quite a lot of it is very emotional, very raw, very cutting, and I really enjoyed this book. It is a really interesting look at what having bipolar disorder is like, and the way that it can impact your life in ways that I don't think I was expecting it to. I enjoyed this book quite a lot, and if Charlotte does bring out another collection of poems, I will definitely be reaching to pick it up, but because this was a non-fiction book, it didn't get any ratings from me. The next book that I read in October was The Very Secret Society of Irregular, which is by Sangu Mandana, and I fell in love with this book almost instantly. This had exactly the right amount of coziness and fantastical elements that are still in our world very firmly that I was looking for from a book. This is following Mika Moon, who is one of the witches that is living in Britain, but her life is basically cloaked in secrecy. Nobody knows that she is a witch. None of her acquaintances, none of her co-workers, not even her housemates have ever known. She moves around every 6 or so months so that she never really gives anybody a reason to think that something is going on. So she's having a really hard time kind of putting relationships together and forming friendships. One day, however, Mika, who has been putting videos online about all of the witchy things that she is doing, but does it in such a tongue-in-cheek manner that people will probably think that she's joking, is noticed by the inhabitants of Nowhere House. This is a small collection of magical people who are living together trying to harness their magic, and they have got 3 young orphaned witches and they need somebody to help them. All witches in this world are orphaned because as soon as they are brought into this world, their mothers will die. So Mika is basically brought in as a maternal figure for 3 young girls who have been brought to Nowhere House from right across the world. She's tasked with teaching Rosetta, Terracotta and Altamira how to train their magic and how to harness its powers and use it mainly for good. But she instantly falls into a stumbling block when she arrives. Rosetta and Altamira take to her like a duck to water. They see her as the perfect mother figure in this house, and they're going to learn everything that they can from her. But Terracotta, who is the middle child, rebels almost instantly. There's a really sweet thing about a third to a half of the way through this book where Terracotta starts to realize the errors of her ways and she really starts to let Mika in, and I thought that that was just so wonderful, but I do think that it should have happened a little bit earlier onto the book. There is another reason that Mika has been brought to Nowhere House, and that is because Lily, who is the kind of the matriarch of the house, is under investigation from her lawyer. And the day after Christmas Day, he is going to arrive, and if things look even a hair out of place, the 3 girls are going to be taken away from everybody. Nobody in the house wants that, and the problem is that Lily has been nowhere to be seen, so they need a little bit more control and they need a little bit more help to keep the cloak over everything. Among the residents of Nowhere House is Jamie. He is the librarian of the house, and he and Mika have sparks flying between them almost instantly. There was a really nice romance between the 2 of them, but what I enjoyed the most is that romance was such a small part of this book. It was probably about 5 to 20% of what was happening here. There was one sex scene, it wasn't very explicit. I think it was actually a little bit clumsy and a little bit clunky. But overall, the main aspects of this book are Mika expanding her friendship circle and getting to know a lot more people, and also the three girls learning more about their magic and integrating that in their everyday lives, as well as trying to save the future of Nowhere House. This was such a wonderful book. This is going to be my October version of A Christmas Carol every single Christmas Eve. I am going to reach for this every single October 1st from here on in, because it has that perfect autumnal vibe that I'm looking for in a book. Even though it is fantastical, and even though there are fantastical elements to it, it's not so heavily fantasy based that it excludes me as a not particularly very fantasy driven reader. I enjoyed it so much. This was by far my book of the month, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read The Husbands by Holly Gramazio. This is a debut novel that instantly struck me when I heard Kayla from Books and Lala talk about it, and then when I heard from Brianna from Four Paws in a Book, who had picked it up for her June TBR. This was such an interesting concept. It is about a young woman named Lauren who comes home from work one day and notices that her husband is sitting at the kitchen table flicking through a magazine, which is a little bit concerning because Lauren lives alone and she's not married. It turns out that when these husbands go into her attic, there is a sudden spark of light and a brand new husband will come back down the stairs. Over the course of this book, you meet a small fraction of the over 200 husbands that Lauren cycles through over the course of about a year or so. I thought it was so interesting. The concept of this book just sounded too good for me not to read it. You do get to spend some more time with these husbands than you do with others, and to be quite honest, there were a couple of husbands that I was really glad that we didn't spend a whole lot of time with. There was one who was emotionally, and I would bet if we had spent more time with him, physically abusive to her. There was a husband that was so boring that he would barely look up from his book to respond to her. So she, within 5 minutes, just sent him up to the attic to respond to a weird noise that she had heard. Then there were the other husbands who had some really interesting lessons to impart or some stories to be part of. There was Felix, who is an investment banker living in London, and the apartment where this magic attic is found was actually in an Airbnb that Felix and Lauren were renting out to people, and I thought that that was such an interesting spin on it. This story, though, will give you the impression of having money is great and having everything that you've ever wanted is wonderful, but if you don't have a partner who is 100% fully on your side, what is genuinely the point of it? I also really loved the story of Carter, who had come over from the US, and he and Lauren had been married for a couple of years and had settled into this really wonderful routine with one another that you're almost hoping he never goes into the attic. I also thought it was really interesting. About halfway through the book, the story ramps up in a way that I don't think I was expecting it to, and if I make any kind of reference to it, it's going to be a massive spoiler. I think it was such an interesting way to expand the world of this a little bit more, and it was such an intriguing read. This is definitely one that I would recommend people to go and pick up if they're interested in books that have a little bit of a fantastical element or a slight touch of magical realism. This is definitely the one that I think you need to go for. I gave this book a very solid 4 stars, and I think this is definitely one I'm going to go back to. Then I read Date with Destiny by Lucy Vine. I've read 2 or 3 of Lucy's other books and I've absolutely loved them. Her sense of humor and her writing style just really work for me. So when I heard that Date with Destiny was coming out earlier in 2024, I instantly had to get a copy of it. This is about Jin, who when she was 16 went to a fortune teller at a fairground who told her that in 16 years' time she was going to go through 3 bad things in her life, but then be blessed with 3 good fortunes as well. When she turns 32, shortly after her 32nd birthday, some of these start to actually come to fruition. The massive heartbreak that she was told to expect happens when her fiance walks out on her just a couple of months before the wedding. There is a huge loss that she is barely able to recover from. And there are a couple of other things that have been adding up as well that look like they might be coming straight out of the pages of this prediction. She and her best friend Mo Van Wei then decide that they are going to take this by the balls and they're going to try and find the psychic who was responsible for these predictions to see how they can A, replace them, or B, completely overcome them. This takes them through a whole host of other fairgrounds across the country, of TV appearances, of phone line sidekicks, genuinely trying to find what's been happening. But what I really enjoyed about this book was the other three good fortunes that are going to come. There was going to be a trip that was an almost once in a lifetime experience. There was going to be a reconnection with somebody that Jin hadn't spoken to in years and years, and she was finally going to find her soulmate. I absolutely loved watching them trying to figure out what was happening in this book, but there were a couple of other threads in here that I really enjoyed pulling at. Jin is working in an engagement ring and jewellery store, which is actually run by her mother, who I had a couple of issues with. I found Celeste to be a really difficult character to spend a lot of time with. She was really narcissistic, she was incredibly self-centered, and once she got an idea into her head, she absolutely had to follow that path no matter how ridiculous or how convoluted it may have sounded. Jin actually had some really great business ideas for the shop, and I thought that she had a really great one that could have made so much sense for the business, but also for the book if they had gone into it a little bit further. But I feel like she was a little bit too meek and too timid to tell her mother, hey, this is something that I've had on my sleeve. I think we should make this happen. Rather than, I've had this idea, what do you think about it? I also had a couple of worries about Celeste because I have a feeling she was somewhat of a functioning alcoholic. Jin and her sister Tony, when you put their names together, she was Jin and Tony C. That brings up gin and tonic. And Ginny tells us in a way that it's supposed to be incredibly funny and it's supposed to be a kind of a funny story to tell strangers or like a fun fact at the pub. But I actually thought that this was a little bit too attention seeking and this was definitely pointing at some underlying issues there. One thing that I found a little bit too much in this book was the story of Ginny trying to find her soulmate, or in other words, the long revolving list of suitors. I felt like there were too many potential soulmates or potential suitors for Ginny across this book for me to give a particular care about any of them. There was one particular person who kept coming up time and time again throughout this book. His name was Zach, and he was working with Ginny as an engagement ring designer for a new concept that the shop was going through. And she would keep telling him, I'm really interested in you, and he would say, no, I'm just interested in you as a friend. And when this kept coming up time and time again, and Ginny would keep telling him she was interested in him, and he would keep telling her that he was just seeing her as a friend, it was like a broken record. And I needed the narrative to move away from this. And I needed to see them then, okay, let's just be friends, completely platonic, no romantic relationship here whatsoever. It got to the stage that if it was starting to look like they were actually going to get together, I actively wanted that not to happen. I wanted these people not to end up together. Thankfully, any romance in this book was very much a secondary or minor plot to the idea of Ginny trying to figure out about this list that she had and kind of picking herself back up from this huge breakup that had completely overthrown her life. To the point that she had almost blacked it out and wasn't in any way accepting of it happening in the first place. I found it a little bit strange that Ginny almost had a psychotic breakdown about the potential of this relationship breaking down and just kept going in life like it hadn't happened in the first place. Even with that little hiccup, overall, I really enjoyed this book and I ended up giving it a 4-star. I'm definitely going to be on the lookout for any other books that Lucy Vine is going to write because her writing style has just always worked for me. And I definitely think you need to go and do that too. Then I started dipping my toes into the pool of horror with You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Kayla Byron. I read this as a buddy read with my friends Margaret from The Word Nerd and Jess from the Hex Library. The three of us just decided that we were going to go for it and I needed something that was going to be an introduction to horror. It was one of the prompts on the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge to read a horror book by a BIPOC author and Kayla Byron just fit the bill perfectly. This is about Chastity, who is working as a final girl in a horror stubborn camp at one of their simulations. On every night of a couple of weeks run, they will have a kind of a simulated horror run where everybody is assigned a role and they are either attacked or attacking. Chastity is often given the role of the final girl, so the last person who is going to survive this bloodbath, But at the end of the summer, there is an entire upheaval. It turns out that the game that has been happening is no longer a game, and people's lives actually are at stake this time. There was an entire subplot about a group of people nearby who were coming in to wreak havoc upon the land that the camp was set on and about the people who are working there. I came into this book with very little expectation. It was going to be the first ever horror book that I had read that wasn't in the Goosebumps series, and I just wanted something that was going to be an introduction to it. I wasn't going to be looking for something that was super big on the horror. I wasn't looking for something super big on gore. I just wanted to see if the genre was something that I might be able to read in future. I'm really glad that I had Margaret and Jess with me, because Margaret was always just a little bit further than me in the book. That meant that she was able to tell me when some specific triggers were coming up that did actually appear in this book. She was able to say to me, hey, I need you to stop reading here, come a couple of pages on, pick up again when the paragraph starts with the final night or something like that. I thought it was a little bit strange that for a book that was so heavily focused on a slasher cult film from the 1980s, about 60 or so percent of the way through the book, we didn't even have anybody who had died. We didn't have any dead bodies around us or anything that was going to lead into a dead body appearing anytime soon. I felt like this was a little bit too far for us to go in and still have everybody doing okay and everybody was still alive. For a book that was supposed to be a slasher, I felt like it needed to have just a little bit more of that action. I also felt that the epilogue that we got at the end of this book could have completely been done away with. It picks up the action about a year after everything had been happening, and to be honest, I think that that could have just been dealt with, and what happened in the epilogue could have just happened on that exact same time. I think it could have just all been cleaned up in one fell swoop, and we didn't need the extra epilogue at all. Am I going to pick up another horror book? Well, there's going to be another horror book in this wrap up anyway, so you know that it is one that I'm going to go back to. But I don't think it's going to be one that I'm going to instantly run out and have to read again. I gave this book a 3.5 stars, and I don't know if I would go back to anything else of this kind of ilk. Then I picked up one of my most anticipated books of 2024 with My Favorite Mistake by Marion Keyes. This is a follow-up to Anybody Out There, which was one of the books of the Walsh Sister series, and this one is following Anna. In Anybody Out There, Anna had moved to New York and was working as a PR in the beauty industry when her husband Aidan was killed in a car crash where they were both involved. Anna came out with some pretty serious injuries, including a facial disfigurement that she still has to this day, whereas Aidan was taken to hospital but lost his life on the journey. It is now 15 or so years later after the events of Anybody Out There, and it is just the start of 2020, so you know what that means. However, we do pick up around 2021 when the borders are back open and Anna is able to go back to Ireland and visit her family for the first time since the pandemic started. She has just gone through a relationship breakup where she and her partner Angelo have figured that they don't really have anything in common anymore. Something that was very common for a lot of relationships through the pandemic, when people were kind of forced together to spend all of this time together that maybe they hadn't been doing before. They would have realized these slight incompatibilities that would have been kind of swept under the rug when life was happening as normal. So when Anna moves back to Ireland, she starts on another PR campaign for a kind of an eco lodge in the west of Ireland that is going through a bit of a tumultuous time at the moment. People in the town are worried that this is going to bring huge numbers of tourists in that the town is just ill-equipped to deal with, and they're also not super on board with the way that it is being built and the way that it is being run. While Anna is doing a little bit of damage control, one of the contractors who is working there is Joey. He and Anna had a couple of dalliances back before Anna had even left for New York, and a couple again after she had come back after Aidan had passed and she was just back visiting family. But things had never really gone on well between the two of them, and as the book progresses, you start to realise the breakdowns that would have happened between the two of them. To be quite honest with you, I am not a fan of the main reason that Anna and Joey didn't really get together, and a lot of the reason for the conflict was Anna. She had gotten these ideas into her head that were a complete different path to how she wanted to live her life and things that she had wanted to do. And once she had gotten fixated on this idea, which, to be honest, probably lasted all of about a month, she was steadfast on her resolution that Joey was the only person who was going to be able to help her to do this. I didn't really like how that was written at all. I found it to be so manipulative and so narcissistic, and it was completely different to the Anna that I had known and loved throughout this book. Something, however, that I did associate with is the kind of feeling that Anna has when she's moved back from New York. Particularly when you're coming back as somebody who has lived away for a while, you feel like you're going to be this shiny new toy that everyone in town is excited to see, and then when the gleam runs out, you feel a little bit left to the side and you feel a little bit unworthy of everything. This is something that I kind of felt when I first moved back after having done a master's abroad, so it was definitely something that I associated with here. What I will say is that there were so many characters in this book. It could definitely have benefited from something like a family tree or a dramatis personae or a list of characters, because there were so many people that you had to try and keep a track of every single time. And new characters kept getting introduced and brought in and built upon, and by the end of it, I didn't care about half of them. Unfortunately, I think Marion is kind of slipping for me recently. I really enjoyed, again, Rachel from last year. I had such a great time with it and was one of my books of the year. But I didn't love My Favorite Mistake as much as I had loved that one. I think it was a little bit too wordy. It is a really big book at about 570 or so pages. It could definitely have been condensed a little bit, and I feel like Marion is overall quite a wordy author. If you can see all of the Marion books that are on my shelf here, they're all super big and super chunky. And a lot of them don't need to be that big. There's no reason that a contemporary story needs to be over 600 pages. To end it though on something more positive, there is a really good representation in here of women who are going through the menopause or trying to stave it off by taking HRT. That wasn't something that I knew you could do. And as a woman in her 30s, it's kind of embarrassing to admit that I didn't know you could take HRT or hormone replacement therapy and kind of buy time back from the menopause. It's definitely something that has opened my eyes a little bit more, and I'm glad now that having read this book, I have a little bit more information on it and I can still go and educate myself a little bit further. But overall, this book just didn't work for me. It ended up being one of my least favorite Marion books, and I only gave it 3 stars. Then I read Rewitched by Lucy Jane Wood. This is another debut, and it was yet another cozy, witchy fantasy book that I ate up completely whole. This is about Belle, or Belladonna Blackthorn, who is in line to become a super powerful witch, and on her 30th birthday is called into the local coven so that she can basically fight her corner and tell them why it is that she deserves to keep her magic. If she hasn't been able to convince them, she's going to have to give her magic back to the coven and live her life as a mortal. Unfortunately, when they go through all of the things that Belle has done throughout her life and the struggle that she has to overcome a couple of tasks, when she first comes to Hawthorne Manor, her magic is at risk of being taken away from her. She is working at a bookstore, and the next day, one of the witches from the coven comes in and tells her that there is a way for her to win her magic back. She has to go and spend time with Artorius, who has been cast aside from the coven and from society because of some terrible crimes that he has committed in his past and has never found his way back into the civilization. Belle spends a lot more time with Artorius, gets to know him a little bit more, learns more about how to use her magic in a better way that she had been doing before, and really opens up the world to him, and he opens up a brand new world to her. However, there are definitely things to look out for as you are going through this book, and there is definitely someone out there who is trying to block all of Belle's attempts to improve upon her magic and to get all of the 6 tasks that she needs to have done by Halloween so that she can keep it for good. I utterly loved Artorius. From the moment that we meet him and we walk into his ramshackled little hut and he stands in front of his cupboard and takes out 2 mugs for tea instead of 1 and laments that he has no idea when the last time he's even taken out a second cup to entertain someone was, it broke my heart in 2. A little side note, but I also loved that one of the side characters in the coven that Belle has to impress was called Aoife. My name is so Irish and so traditional, but really popular in Ireland and in no way popular at all in the rest of the world. I've never gone to a place outside of Ireland where people have instantly known how to recognize my name and how to pronounce it just from having seen it. So hearing about my name in the book and seeing it written down on the pages was just phenomenal. It's the exact same thing that I feel like people who are named Hannah or people who are named Emily or Beth or Grace are going to go through. So it's just a little bit more special to me that now I had that kind of feeling as well. I really loved that there were so many references to the 90s in this book, particularly one to Isadora, which was a children's TV show that was run on CITV, the children's branch of ITV in the UK. And Isadora, the witch in there, her catchphrase was "Izzy Wizzy, let's get busy." When I saw that in the pages of the book, I almost did a double take because it is such a niche reference to so many people. I just loved seeing it in the pages here. Something that I think I would have preferred to be explored in this book is Belle getting her magic back in a different way. Before everything had happened with the tasks and before everything had happened on her birthday, quite a lot of the magic that Belle had been doing was incredibly selfish. She had rerouted a friend's university letter so that they would end up going to the same college, for example, or she had completely revamped people's schedules so that they had more time for her rather than more time for work or more time for a partner. I didn't love that aspect of her personality, and I feel like that was never really addressed in her getting her magic back. It was kind of like a message that the way that she was living her life was completely fine, with absolutely no repercussions or consequences to that. And I feel like there should have been some kind of hint towards you need to improve on your personality and you need to improve on the reasons that you are casting spells so that we are in a position to look it over and to give you your magic back. There is a slight, and I mean very slight, romance in this book, and I'm really glad that that didn't take center stage at any point. There was one scene where they had gotten together. I didn't particularly love the ways that they had gotten together in that scene at all, and I would have preferred if it had happened a little bit more naturally, but overall, that was such a small aspect of this book. The whole thing was really about Belle figuring out how to get her magic back and taking control of it, and really just trying to get herself back to who she was beforehand. I felt like that was a much better way to deal with it, and overall, that made for more interesting reading than the romance ever would have. I absolutely loved this book. I gave it a 4 stars, and I know that another book in the series by the same author has just been announced, and I am absolutely going to go and check that one out next year. Then I read the other horror book that I tried out in October, Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle, and yes, that Chuck Tingle. I hadn't read Camp Damascus because last year I definitely wasn't reading any horror, but I had heard so many people talking about Bury Your Gaze that I simply had to read it. Somehow, the FOMO even got to me, an unabashed, not a horror reader. This is about Misha, who is working as a scriptwriter in LA, and he is brought into his executive producer's office one morning. He is told that the 2 characters he is just about to write into a relationship after years and seasons of teasing the 2 women getting together and almost kisses and almost going home with one another. He's just about to write them into a scene together and they're going to have their happy ending until Jack puts a kibosh on everything. Jack actually wants him to kill off both, if not one, of these 2 characters because that's what's going to get people talking and that's what's going to drive up the ratings. Misha is completely against this. He knows about the bury your gaze trope and he knows about how LGBT people are treated on screens and how their stories are never given the happy endings that they deserve. So he fights back against this and decides that he's just going to write whatever he wants. When he leaves the office, somehow all of the horror monsters that he had written into short stories or short films or films from the past start to come to life. Mrs. Y has turned up on a plane that he is going on. The black lamb is outside his door. The smoker is standing at the balcony and waiting for a light, which unfortunately Misha doesn't have. So he now has a limited amount of time to figure out what is happening with everything and to get the world back in order before utter chaos ensues. He and his friend Tara have been caught up in everything that is happening, and Misha is just worried that his boyfriend Zeke is also going to be a casualty of all of this. This book was such an interesting discussion about how LGBT people are portrayed on screens and the writings that they are given, the storylines that they have to go through, and the happy endings that they just never seem to get. I thought it was so on the ball for everything that we are seeing these days. And I know that a lot of Chuck Tingle's books have that kind of social commentary running through them. So I thought that this was such an interesting way to do it. I also thought, and this might be a misreading of the story, but I thought that Misha himself had a little bit of internalized homophobia. He never particularly wanted to be seen out with Zeke in public, and he was very wary about camera phones being around when they were kissing each other, for example. And he was always a little bit wary of Zeke being a bi person. I thought that this was written really interestingly for somebody who must have come from a small town or must have had that kind of religious upbringing. I thought it was written in a really striking way. Admittedly, this book lost concept for me as we kept going through. By about 70% of the way through or so, I feel like I have no idea what's happening in this book. I felt like it was getting a little bit too convoluted for me. It was getting a little bit too chaotic. And there were times that I genuinely just lost the thread of what was going on at all. It was overall a really good story, and it was overall really well written and really engaging, but I gave it 3 stars because I just couldn't get over that little bump that I had in the middle where I had no clue what was happening, and I really had to go back a couple of times, figure out what was going on, and try and get back on track. So it was a great story, but it was just a 3-star for me. Then I read Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Q. Sutanto. This was a reread for me of the first book in the series, and I think I enjoyed it so much more this time around. What I particularly loved about this book is the author's note that Jessie has at the beginning of the book, which chronicles a little bit of her upbringing and the ways that she communicates with her parents. Jessie, for instance, is fluent in English, speaks kind of okay Mandarin, and doesn't really speak a whole lot of Indonesian, whereas her parents speak fluent Mandarin as their first language, can get by with Indonesian, but have little to no English. Communication between these people is a little bit staggered and can be a little bit chaotic because you might struggle over a couple of words, or you might not have the word that you want to express yourself, and you can't express yourself with 2 people that you are supposed to be so close to. You can't express yourself in a way that you might want to in such a fluid way just because of that language barrier. Then onto the book. This book is about Medi Chen, who goes out on a blind date one night, which was set up by her mother, and ends up killing the guy that she is with. It's a little bit chaotic because the day after, she and her mothers are going to be the vendors at one of the biggest weddings the city has ever seen. It is a Chino-Indonesian wedding which is being held on a small island off the coast of the US, and I really loved that this book brought in that Chino-Indonesian wedding culture. I haven't really experienced a whole lot of that. I've seen it a little bit in Crazy Rich Asians, but it was also so interesting to see it from another point of view. You learn things about the envelope ceremony beforehand, you learn things about the tea ceremony that the families go through, and it was just interesting to see what a wedding is like from a different culture that wasn't my own. Another way that chaos is thrown into the loop is that the owner of this hotel is Nathan. Medi and Nathan had met in college, and they had a relationship when Medi wasn't so surrounded by her mother and her aunties anymore. And Medi really felt like this relationship had a chance to go somewhere except for the family curse. Every man who marries into the family disappears after a couple of years, and that wasn't a chance that Medi was willing to take, so she cuts their relationship off just as it is about to get serious. But 10 years or so down the line, they've met each other once again, and they're ready to pick up where things had left off. I really enjoyed watching their relationship blossom and explore all over again, but I do think that they needed to have a much deeper conversation about what had happened the first time and why all of these things had been happening, and actually talk about it before they got back together. I really loved watching the second chance romance that didn't particularly feel second chance romancy to me. It's not a trope that I often reach for, but I had such a great time with this book. The Aunties in here are completely chaotic. One of my favorite characters is Fourth Aunt. I feel like she is such a little hurricane throughout this entire book, but I love all 4 of these women, and I cannot wait to continue on with the rest of the series. I know that The Good, the Bad, and the Aunties, the last book in the trilogy, has just recently come out this year, and I'm definitely going to go back and read 4 Aunties and a Wedding before I go back into it. As much as I loved the book the last time, I loved it even more this time, and I ended up giving it a 4.5 stars. Then I read Over the Influence by Jojo, or Joanna Levesque. Jojo was a huge pop star back in the very early 2000s with Leave, Get Out, and Too Little Too Late, but it almost felt like she completely disappeared off the face of the earth. Jojo had been quietly working behind the scenes on writing new music and releasing everything, but it just hadn't come out to so much fanfare. In Over the Influence, she explains everything that had been happening in her childhood, her parents, their relationship with each other, their relationship with alcohol and with drugs, and how it was to be brought up in a situation like that, where her parents, who had met at Alcoholics Anonymous, got in a relationship together, had gotten pregnant, had a child, and the kind of relationship that they had, not just with alcohol, but with each other and with Jojo herself. It also talks about her childhood, about the bullying and the exclusion that she had gone through in school, all of the talent shows that she had gone through, her discovery as an artist, and the way that her music had been written, had been promoted, and her career just took off. I really loved catching up with her. I had always kind of wondered what had happened with Jojo when she kind of fell off the face of the earth a couple of years ago. I loved her music. I had seen her in a couple of films and thought that she was a really strong actress. But learning about what had been happening behind closed doors and the things that you were never party to was terrifying. There were a lot of stories about her parents' suicidal ideation. There were a lot of stories about Jojo's own struggles with addiction, be that from alcohol or from food or from drugs. There were a lot of stories of infidelity and of relationship breakdowns and of kind of toxic relationships, not just personally, but also in a professional manner as well. Some of them were particularly hard to read and they must have been incredibly difficult to deal with. But I feel like Jojo really wrote everything so raw and so truthfully that it just hit a bone with me. Jojo's father passed away in around 2015, and in this book she pens a letter to him that she knows he's never going to read, but that she just wanted to get out on the pages, and I sobbed listening to that. It was so heartbreaking and it was so beautifully written. I feel like it was the perfect eulogy to this relationship that she had and to the man that he was. If you were interested in Jojo's music, if you had seen her in a couple of films and you just wanted to know what her life was like, this is an absolutely fantastic book to pick up. Finally, I read Ramona the Pest by Beverly Cleary. I read this because there was a prompt in the Pop Sugar Reading Challenge where you needed to read a book that was set 24 years before you were born, and this was published and set in 1968. This is about Ramona, who is about 6 years old and is just going off to kindergarten for the first time, and it is full of all of the misunderstandings and the miscommunications that you would expect from that. Like, she is told by her teacher that I need you to just sit here for the present, and Ramona gets so excited that she's about to get a gift from her teacher for her first day, and nobody else was told this, so she's the special student. I absolutely loved this book. It was so full of childhood wonder and all of the little things that you would get wrong just because of childhood innocence. I've never read a Ramona and Beezus book before. I've never seen the movie that had Selena Gomez in it from a couple of years ago. So this was a really nice introduction for me to the series. I don't think it's one that I'm going to reach for again anytime soon. It was just a gentle little story that was taking me over and taking off a box that I needed to in another reading challenge that I was doing, and it was just a really nice 3-star read. Those are all of the books that I read across the month of October. What was the best book that you read over October? Or what is one book that you have got for the end of this year? If you'd love to leave me a comment but you can't think of anything you'd like to say, then just leave me a Halloween style emoji. Don't forget to like and subscribe because I have new videos up every week. Now, get on out of here.